Welcome, all you people out there who either watch my videos or listen on Apple and or on Spotify, because yes, this show has been converted into a podcast for all of you who want to listen to me, but not look at my beautiful face as I give you these amazing videos. So, links in the description or search Actual Justice Warrior, whatever. Today we're going to talk about a self-defense case, maybe, out of Las Vegas involving an Asian shop owner and a smoke shop robbery. Now, before we get into this video, of course, is going to be sponsored by some company, which actually is a long-term sponsor and is a fantastic company with a fantastic offer. So I'm going to toss it over to them, and then we're going to come back over here and we'll discuss this whole situation on the other side. A new investigation shows us that law enforcement is using something called a reverse keyword search in order to look at search phrases and determine whether or not you should be investigated for a crime. This is a giant violation of your privacy, and guess what? Google's not doing anything about it. This is one of the reasons why I highly recommend you guys get on board with Virtual Shield. Virtual Shield works better than any of the tips and tricks you'll hear in YouTube videos or online forums because they have the tools to secure your privacy. It is a strict no-log VPN, so even when law enforcement goes fishing for your information, they won't be able to find it. It hides your ISP, has a bunch of other benefits like that international streaming thing where you could change your location, and on top of that, for listeners and viewers of this show, you can go to virtualshield.com/justice and get yourself a free 30-day trial of the service. See if you like it. I'm certain you will. Protect all your devices, and on top of that, they're throwing in a 30-day money-back guarantee, which, if you're not good at the maths, that's essentially a 2-month trial of Virtual Shield, which you're going to absolutely enjoy at virtualshield.com/justice. So chances are you have already seen this video of two people trying to rob this Asian smoke shop owner, one of them jumping the counter, and the Asian shop owner reacting by stabbing this person, and of course the screams and cries for help and this person actually saying that he's dead. Now, it's actually not the case. It turns out, according to multiple reports, both individuals involved in this robbery were in fact arrested. One of them is recovering at the hospital, so nobody died in this situation. However, this has brought up an interesting debate about self-defense, and that's what we're going to get into. But first and foremost, you guys know how I feel about crime, you guys know how I feel about criminals, and more importantly, you guys know how I feel about this cultural shift into empathizing with the criminal and somehow disregarding the law-abiding citizen that is just trying to do their job, that should not have to be subject to victimization, either through their business or through harm to their body or through the loss of their life, due to the fact that people are under the impression that all criminals are somehow Aladdin. So obviously, emotionally, I am definitely on the side of the shop person in this instance. I feel like you have the right to defend your property. I feel like private property rights are sacred, and we need that as a cultural touchstone in order to have a productive and prosperous society. And I have no sympathy for the criminals that seek to perpetually victimize this guy, and I understand, based on what he saw on the news, why he perceived this as a potential deadly threat or more dangerous situation. However, what we're going to do in the course of this video is break down the legalese surrounding this incident. So even though I don't want this guy to go to jail, even though I don't think morally he did something wrong, I have to break it down in terms of the potential risk, because what we're talking about is the confines legally of self-defense, not how I feel on a visceral level about criminals and about this situation. And by the way, the video is very hard to watch. I'm going to show you a very blurred version of it. In fact, I'm probably going to have to block out the whole screen, but I will describe it to you. It's a person being stabbed, so it's not going to be a good situation. So without further ado, we're going to go into the beginning part of the video where you can see the setup for this situation, and then we'll talk about it piece by piece, and I'll explain where I think this shop owner is either in the right or in the wrong.
Huh? Why are you guys wearing masks like that?
So the first thing that you'll notice in this video, if you actually watch it, is the fact that the guy comes from behind some area in the back without really acknowledging that two people came in with ski masks into his store. He's talking to them like they're regular customers because he's being activated by that sound of people walking through the door, you know, the doo-doo sound, and that's what's leading him to be in a situation where he might potentially be trapped by robbers because he wasn't paying attention. That's something just to take note of if you're working in retail, that you should be alert to your surroundings, because at any moment you could be confronted confronted with armed robbers, but you don't want to walk into the confrontation with armed robbers, obviously. Then you see the store owner actually look up, or he might just be a guy who works at the store, look up at the people in the mask, and you see them ready to go, and he asks them straight up, why are you wearing masks?
Why are you guys wearing masks like that?
Say what?
Can you guys just leave?
Now, when he notices that they're wearing the mask, two things happen. First and foremost is what you hear, which is this guy telling them to leave. The second thing that you should notice, and I'll describe it to you for the podcast listeners out there, is that his hand that is by where the scanner is actually goes down and reaches for the knife, which is going to be the example of force in this situation. Now, these people are kind of standing around. They look like very inexperienced robbers, and right now the situation has not escalated to the point where it's a deadly threat. And one of the reasons why this is crucial is because in a legal self-defense case, the perceived threat is what it's all about. Whether or not a reasonable person in this situation would view these guys as a threat of serious injury or great bodily harm or death. And this guy's calmly telling them to leave, which creates a trespassing situation. However, trespassing under Nevada law does not create the necessary prerequisite for you to be in a self-defense situation. Also, those of you might bring up the castle doctrine and all that. It does not apply in this situation because it's a store where you can walk in, and if somebody's already in and then you ask them to leave, you can't just kill them if they don't immediately comply. So that's not the situation that we're in. For those of you who are going to bring up the castle doctrine because that's something that you heard, that's just not applicable in this scenario. We're talking about Nevada law and why this might actually be a sketchy situation for our shopkeep.
Can you guys just leave?
Nah, I'm just sleeping like him.
Jacob, come here. Can I just get the... Alright, take the money in it. I keep the coins. I need the coins.
So one of the things that you'll notice about this video, and you can actually hear it in the audio, is the fact that these two robbers are idiots. They're total buffoons, and they almost see this as a joke, which honestly, in part, makes me more angry. So he asks them to leave, and the guy says, nah, grabs the tip jar, and then he says, okay, listen, you can take the money, whatever, just leave me the change, because I actually have to give people change in order to operate my store so I can do my job. He's trying to make the robbery as inconvenient for him as possible. And by the way, I'm saying robbery in a colloquial sense. This is actually a larceny at this point, and it's actually a petty larceny at this point, because under Nevada law, you have to steal over $1,200 for it to be a grand larceny. However, this guy reacts to this semi-compliance with the larceny by going back over the counter and reaching over and grabbing stuff. So when the shopkeep goes after the first person who took the tip jar wearing the white shirt, who went for the merchandise by reaching over the counter, the second guy dressed in all black jumps the counter. And the knife that we were talking about earlier is in his hand at this point in time. And then the viral part of the video happens where the shopkeep actually goes towards the person who's grabbing stuff from behind the display. And this is where you guys have seen what you need to see, and I'll play it, but obviously I have to black it out for YouTube, and I'll be describing what happens, but the links will be in the description so you guys can check it out and watch it for yourself and actually know what's happening.
Bro, okay.
I'm dead.
So a crucial thing in this situation in terms of the law is the fact that he comes up from behind him and he actually stabs him about 3 times before the robber even knows what's going on and starts to fight back. He's also screaming, and eventually he ends up saying the iconic line of "I'm dead." I'll play that for you so you can hear it.
I'm dead. I'm dead.
Now, after this guy says "I'm dead, I'm dead," the shopkeep, which is good for him, by the way, in terms of the legalese, actually does not continue stabbing him and begins dragging him to the front of the counter, which, by the way, if you look at the way that this store is constructed, the counter is almost like a U that covers most of the store, so you can make the argument that the shopkeep in this situation felt trapped. And remember, the door to the back room, which is where the shopkeep came from earlier, is actually something that was behind the person who is grabbing the merchandise. So one of the arguments that a lawyer might use in terms of a self-defense situation is that he thought he might have a weapon, but in reality, the situation was so dire because he knew he couldn't flee from this guy. And the other guy, even though he had left the store at a certain point, no honor amongst thieves, could have been waiting outside and could have attacked him if he tried to flee. Therefore, he had legitimate justification to flee for his life. However, unfortunately, based on Nevada law, it appears like what was being committed, and a reasonable person on a jury might assess this if they were looking at it objectively, was a petty larceny, and therefore this did not represent a serious threat to the shopkeep's health or his body or a potential threat of death. Now, we know that people can pull out weapons at any time. We know, and I am of the belief, that once you get behind the counter, almost all bets are off. However, we're talking about this from a strictly letter of the law standpoint, and by the letter of the law, it looks like this shopkeep is actually in trouble. The fact that he did stop the force when this guy no longer presented any threat is a good sign for him. It shows that maybe he was just trying to get him away, etc., etc. But it also looks like an incident where he was trying to kill somebody over merchandise, and we have established case law that you can't do that. Somebody would have to be a serious violent felon for you to kill them, and one of the arguments used to justify this standard is that somebody's life is worth more than a candy bar. So that common law, that case law, actually specifically applicable to stealing merchandise in stores and the use of deadly force not being warranted in those scenarios. So this guy would be in a lot of trouble if the district attorney decided to press charges, and if not for the fact that people are emotionally on his side, and a sympathetic jury would likely acquit him anyway, even if by the letter of the law, he is actually in violation of the law. Now, I know some of you are going to point to the Jose Alba case, which I talked about on this channel out of New York City, and how New York City has weaker self-defense protections than in Las Vegas. But what you have to remember about the Alba case is that was not a robbery. That was not somebody trying to shoplift or steal stuff or larceny or anything like that. That was an incident where somebody who was in their 30s came behind the counter specifically to assault an elderly man. That was his primary objective. And by the time that Alba did the stabbing, this guy had a grip on the shirt that he was wearing by the back of the neck, and Alba could not get away from this scenario. This person engaged him, he went toward him to engage him, and I wish for the life of me he carried a pepper spray or some kind of bat behind the counter, because he engaged him with deadly force, and that is really where the issue at hand is. If you go into a situation that does not warrant deadly force, or where deadly force is not reasonable to be expected, and you use deadly force to defend yourself, you're in a situation where you have an imperfect self-defense, and you are vulnerable to criminal charges. And you guys might not like this, and again, I'm super sympathetic to the fact that these criminals are idiots and they deserve punishment, and we should not be granting them grace or anything like that when they make horrible decisions like this. Running these small businesses, you're especially vulnerable to theft, so they're actually stealing his livelihood, how he feeds his family, etc., etc. So they're not Aladdin or anything like that. But what we're talking about is Nevada law, and under Nevada law, this guy's in a lot of trouble. And one of the things that he actually did, which I would heavily not advise anybody to do at all whatsoever, is he did a Reddit AMA after the video went viral, and he stated things related to the case that can later come back to bite him if the prosecution decides to actually pursue charges against this individual. And considering this guy was stabbed multiple times, and when he did this AMA, he could have potentially died at the hospital, this could lead to serious problems. On top of that, while he's protecting a certain amount of merchandise, which again, if it's a petty larceny, we're talking about under $1,200 worth of merchandise, and it's the principle, by the way, that matters more than the merchandise. I'm 100% aware of that. He could end up in a scenario where he or the property manager that rents them the space to the store actually gets sued by this guy, making this guy much richer for the fact that he was committing a crime against this person. So really, it's not a good idea in multiple different levels to escalate force beyond the point that it is clearly presented against you. And I understand not taking any chances, but it did not look like they had a weapon, and I could understand how, according to the letter of the law specifically, he could be facing conviction. However, I don't think a conviction is very likely, because I would think if you brought this before a jury and jurors who actually live in this area had to look at this situation, they would say, you know what, this guy jumped the counter, he presented himself as enough of a threat, whatever the letter of the law says, I'm going to acquit on this instance. However, it just needs to be pointed out that this is a much weaker case of self-defense than the Alba situation, much weaker than the Kyle Rittenhouse situation, and the video could lend itself to a civil proceeding or lend itself to criminal prosecution, and a good store owner who is reacting to a series of circumstances, thefts that have been on the rise, and problems of these people trying to take the food off of his family's table could end up in jail for a significantly long period of time based on the fact that he did not have a less lethal option behind the counter, which you gotta carry for these in-between situations. Now, I know a bunch of people are going to start quoting statistics at me that they heard on other videos, and believe me, I've heard them, and they're not very good arguments, especially for what I'm specifically addressing, which is the letter of the law in the state of Nevada. And one of the statistics that I've seen is that in robberies, 50+% of the time, the person committing the robbery has a weapon. But the thing is, those are robbery statistics, so that's a person-to-person situation where you attempt to take something off a person, which obviously a force multiplier, a weapon, would be a good advantage. What this scenario is, qualifies as a larceny. So this would be the equivalent of shoplifting, even though it's more aggressive than your standard shoplifting. And if you look at shoplifting statistics, the percentage of those people, which this would be categorized as under the letter of the law in Nevada, a petty larceny, do not typically use weapons in order to steal merchandise from stores. It's just not the case. So those statistics, while they're interesting and while this looks like a robbery because of the mask, and I understand the confusion, are actually not relevant to this. And even if those statistics were 85% of robberies happen to have weapons involved, and this was a robbery, the fact is no weapon was presented, and there was other context clues presented to lead us to believe that this was more of a snatch and grab type robbery rather than something with a weapon. So again, while I'm sympathetic to the store owner, while I, on a jury, would not convict the store owner, I can tell you that according to the letter of the law, he is in a lot of trouble if a prosecutor decided to pursue this case. But more importantly, more fundamentally, what you guys need to understand out there in the audience is the concept, the principle of self-defense, so that you don't end up in a situation where you might face charges because of the fact that you acted in a way you thought was protected based on people's reactions emotionally to this video. Because even if this guy never gets charged, even if the district attorney in this case says, you know what, I'm gonna let this one go, that doesn't mean your district attorney won't charge you, and that doesn't mean you won't be convicted. There's a lot of stories about the fight after the fight, the legal battles when prosecutors decide to overstep their bounds and pursue murder charges or other criminal charges against people who defend themselves, and that's a real thing. That's one of the reasons why stand your ground hearings, which are pre-trial hearings, were actually put into law in the first place in certain states in the country. But those aren't a lot of states that allow you pre-trial to get a review by a judge where they can dismiss it before you have to hire a lawyer. A lot of times people end up in long, lengthy legal battles, spending thousands of dollars. Sometimes they need to raise the money in order to fight these legal battles due to the fact that they acted in a way that they thought was protected but was ambiguous enough that left them in danger. Now, I know a lot of people will say better to be judged by 12 than to be carried by 6. Obviously, I agree with that, but we have to look at the specific circumstances of the case, and I'm giving you advice going forward out there into the future because I don't want you to end up in this legal gray area that this very solid citizen who's working a legitimate job ended up in based on a reaction to people who entered his store. Also, again, just recommend a pepper spray, just recommend maybe a taser, just recommend maybe a baseball bat behind the counter, because while some of those things could be escalated to deadly weapons, they're not typically classified as deadly weapons, and thus the force would have been more proportional, and thus you would have been able to get yourself out of that situation. And seeing this guy beat up with a baseball bat or pepper sprayed in the face or tased by this guy and then being dragged out would have been just as satisfying, and honestly more satisfying, because I don't want to watch videos of people dying than what we got in this scenario without the possibility of criminal charges. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments of this video or in the podcast. Tweet them at me at I'mSean90. Links are all in the description, whatever. And yeah, I actually want to know what you guys think, unless you're going to give me that emotional reaction that doesn't account for the fact that I'm talking about the law, then you could just buzz off. But like this video, show me by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social media, support me via the support links in the description box of this video. This has been me talking about the Vegas stabbing case. Till next time.